Welcome back to Trending in Education. Dan Trevor, Mike Palmer along with you, and we are closing out or starting to close out the 2019 year of episodes by looking back at the year that was. We're going to be using an Edutopia article, a great one that looks back at research in 2019 as a foundation. But first and foremost, always like to check in. Mike, how are you doing as 2019 comes to a close?
I'm doing wonderfully well, Daniel, and thank you for asking. It's been a nice year. It's a nice year, and years with nines in them are interesting because it's like the odometer is about to turn over. So like you kind of want to savor it a little bit. That was a reference to the way car odometers used to operate before they went digital. But yeah, it's like the turning of a page, the end of a chapter, both for the year, and then when it's a 9-year, it's time to look back on 10 years. And then I think we're going to start looking forward, not just 1 year, but also maybe trying to look ahead for 10 years. So like, it's an interesting, it's the most it's felt like this to me since 1999 is like, like you're entering into a new phase. You're looking at a big chunk of time that is passing, and then something new is on the horizon. So like, I think that feeling is, it's kind of like in the air, Dan. And then it's interesting at the same time to kind of focus a little more closely on the year in research, which is what we're going to talk about today. Youki Terada did a really nice job, I think, outlining the major findings in educational research over the course of 2019. And it is just a reminder that people are doing the really hard work of science like every day, and a lot of work goes into what turns into a few paragraphs in an article like this, and maybe a conversation that you and I have. But it is impressive to look at the breadth of research that's emerging. And it's really a credit to the people who do that type of work, and also folks like Youki who are writing up these things. But then I think it's super interesting for us as a trend spotting show to kind of see what is the actual peer-reviewed research saying. And obviously there's more than just this, but these were the most newsworthy educational research findings throughout 2019. So I thought it's a nice way to sort of reflect back on the year. So I don't know how you wanted to break it down, Dan, but yeah, I'm doing wonderfully well.
Well, I do want to take a self-congratulatory lap here in a sense, because a lot of these topics that are listed in this article are topics we've touched on throughout the year and hit on as the research came out, or we've talked about doodling in the past, which is one of the mentions here. We've talked about the access gaps. We've talked about things throughout the year. The summer slide was something we hit on as well. So I do think as a trend spotting show, a little bit of a grading here. Good to see our topics match up with what this author has put together, and that we're staying on top of those things. But
I don't know if did we go like 10 for 10? Like what was our hit rate?
I think we're batting over 300, which is all I care about. But I think we are starting to talk about. We've talked. Let's see. Scroll. All right, we've hit on, I would say, half. I would say is about right. There are some in here that we will hit on in the next year, and to Mike's point, are really starting to be even more forward thinking, not just the year to come, but the next 10 years, 20 years in education, and looking with maybe a wider lens at what could be happening in learning. But Mike, I think 2019 has research that maybe debunks things from 2010, and education and learning is a science or research field that is ever changing, and we're learning new things each and every year that can prove or help out new things for students and for online learners. But the one that I do love here at the top is the idea of doodling versus drawing. And we've talked about doodling before, and we talked about the idea of, and I like the distinction in this study of defining what they are. So often we use words interchangeably that maybe aren't properly vetted or properly used. And here in this article and also in the research, the difference between drawing your notes, trying to think through it, and doodling something completely unrelated on the side of your notebook are clearly two different things, but are often used almost as synonyms.
Yeah. And there might be a blurry line or a fine line or a line you could erase between those two things, depending on how you want to define a doodle. You know, how on topic does the drawing have to be for it to be a drawing and not a doodle? I'm not exactly sure, but it's super thought provoking, thought provocative, if that's a thing. That almost like the output of what you do with your hand, the actual physical activity is very similar, but the impact on learning is very different depending on the context and how it relates to what you're trying to encode for yourself. So reminded me a little bit of when we were talking about memory palaces as well, where like there are, or cognitive hacks is another thing that I like to talk about, where like there are lots of tactics that are effective learning tools, and there are cognitive scientists, cognitive psychologists, neuroscientists, people who are researching this, social psychologists, sociologists. The list literally goes on and on. They're all doing the professional work to document how brain function, cognitive function relates to behaviors like drawing. And it is interesting how you can even begin to isolate these sort of mental models that exist in the learner. I think it's super fascinating. Plus, we talk all the time about the picture superiority effect, the idea that like visual inputs are, they access different brain centers, they deepen the processing and help you consolidate and remember things better. And we live in such a visual age, particularly around social media, and we talk a lot about making things, so like, be a creator, be a drawer, is an interesting, call to action. And yeah, I wonder how good the doodles are too, like, so
That's exactly where I was going to go.
Trade-offs, right? So like if by virtue of your doodling, you become a cartoonist, or an animator, what were you not learning
Yep.
while you were making something pretty good, or at least, upskilling yourself for future work? It's an interesting question. Yeah, I thought we could maybe just, sort of lightning round through them all, Dan, but other thoughts on the doodling versus drawing?
That's right where I was as well. The quality over quantity of doodles, and does that matter? And do we maybe encourage people who might say they're not good artists or not good drawers to attempt to draw their notes or draw what they're hearing, and how does that play in all of it? But more studies to come. Happy to quickly run through. Absolutely.
Yeah. Just one other thing on the doodling one though too is like it is a cautionary note to teachers too. Like if everybody in your class is doodling, you may want to work a little harder to get them on task. And this is an interesting note too, where you could say, listen, for those of you who are interested in drawing, research has shown that you're going to understand what I'm talking about better if you're drawing your notes rather than purely writing them. And even encouraging your class to be creative about what you're drawing to help consolidate your memory, and then ideally, walk around the room, have people show their work. So I think there's ways to kind of like model what's okay to also help unlock the creativity of your class. So I was really happy that they let off with this one, because there's quite a few, so I thought we could just about at this pace, whatever pace you think makes sense, but I think we try to get through the whole list.
Yep.
Without going too terribly long. Yeah.
Yes, awards don't boost attendance. Teachers do. I would love to say, well, common sense. Great teachers and teachers caring about their students will boost students wanting to be in the classroom. I think we've seen this, the whole teacher movement. We've talked about that many times over here on the podcast. But the idea of having a caring, involved teacher in the classroom will want students to come, giving them a star on a sticker chart, or perhaps a pen from a pen box, or a squishy of some sort. Doesn't seem to resonate the same way that the teacher being involved and caring does for the student wanting to come to school.
Yeah. And it sounded like that extended to like, did they call to follow up about the student who wasn't showing up? So like, was there a genuine effort to understand the student in her own shoes, you know? So like, you know, is there an attempt um, to be present in a human way, or is it more transactional, you know? So like the idea that the teacher wanted you there is more of an incentive. It reminds me of the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic rewards, or, you know, social emotional versus sort of monetary, or you know, extrinsic stuff, you know. But it the flip side, I thought, was what was maybe a little more interesting, and they didn't go into depth. I'd like to dig in a little further into the research, but was that the extrinsic rewards, giving a star or giving a pen or giving whatever to folks who attend perfect attendance, they said that could also backfire. So like I started thinking about what those backfires might look like, and I think part of it might be, once you can't get perfect, you're like, well, screw it, you know, like why even show up? And then also like there is a little bit of like, oh, look at little Mr. Perfect over there, perfect attendance. I'm gonna sit in the back of the class and be a little cooler than that. I don't need your little gold star, you know. So do you want to create that kind of dynamic versus, I want to know you and your family, and I want to make sure when you don't make it into class, I'm asking about that. But that also made me think about like, how do we give teachers the bandwidth to do that type of outreach, particularly when their class sizes get big, they don't necessarily have a good number or a good way to reach their kids, and then even just the teachers themselves are burnt out. You know, do they have the time, particularly when there's bigger absentee rate, you know, more absenteeism? That means more calls.
Right.
That means more families to get to know. So it's sort of like, you know, it's like a tipping point problem. Like once too many of your students are having attendance problems, I think even the good practices here are not enough. So I don't think it's exclusively, you know, on the teacher to manage this outreach.
Right.
But it is a reminder that probably the best way to have engaged students is to have engaged teachers.
Yep, and I would agree with that. And I think as it discusses further, just the engagement in the classroom itself too, like you know, not necessarily the absence, but just being an engaging teacher. I would anecdotally say the teachers I remember best are the ones that cared about me most, not the ones that necessarily were the best teachers, that I learned most from, but the ones that did seem to care more and were more engaged with my life and what was going on even outside the classroom.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I love the next topic in the way they phrase it. Math circuitry looks the same in boys and girls. Yeah. So a study here, 3 to 10-year-old, 104 students. How does the brain work when dealing with math? And conclusions drawn that math, you know, work is largely societal, that the difference between boys and girls isn't based on brain chemistry or the way we're wired, but much more just simply how society has put constructs around
socially constructed, Dan. You know, I'm a social psychology guy back from back in the day. So social constructivism is an interesting idea, but it's the idea that like a lot of things that we feel are innate, you know, natural ways in which humans think about things, talk about things, engage with each other, are actually created through our social interactions, our society, and our culture. And it's a pretty deep idea, but you know, the interesting thing in this article about the gender gap around math, which is the sort of stereotype in the U.S. Some of that is reinforced. You know, those stereotypes can actually reinforce the biases that they're not actually that there's no truth to. And I think that in fact may have been the case in the U.S. You know, the whole trope of the Barbie that says math is hard, you know, is kind of like, talk about zeitgeisty. Like that's been around, like that story has been around for like 40 years now. But it's really interesting. In the flip side is also true that like in some Scandinavian countries, it's always Scandinavia, but in some Scandinavian countries, the gender relations to math are reversed. You know, so you know the stereotype there is that girls are better at math, and it is interesting that once that stereotype is out there, then the research starts to back it up, and it is tricky. It's a little bit of a chicken egg thing, and I think we all need to be on guard about like bias and stereotyping, and particularly in the ways that it's limiting, in the ways that it's helps people thrive. I think that can be good. That's where you'd almost want to tell both girls, girls, you tell girls that they're great at math, and then you tell boys that they're also great at math.
Right.
So
It's
although you tell them they're working hard, right? Like you don't tell them they're great at math. It's very difficult. All this educational research, like what are we supposed to do with it? How do we keep it straight? Well, I got one answer. You listen to Training in Education.
There you go. I was going to say you put a sheet of paper and leave the room and see what happens when you come back, but probably not the best way to go about teaching. I will say what you mentioned about studies and self-fulfilling prophecies is, to an extent, I've used that before, where you sort of will something into existence simply by saying over and over again it's going to happen. The next topic up, the idea of the summer slide, I think talks about research and how one piece of research being quoted again and again and again isn't necessarily solved science, right? It's not that this is done. It's just that people found a piece of data that works for a narrative they want to tell. And I was a journalism student for a while. I worked as a journalist, but when you find a fact, it works a lot of the times to use it when you're writing a story. And if you don't do the extra research to see what backs it up, we have research like this, the summer slide, which we talked about on the podcast this past summer, is the idea that why do students come back not as prepared? And the study was flawed. The study was flawed and didn't really have context, didn't really have a good pool of data. Right. And now we're seeing new studies unable to replicate that data.
Right. Well, it's also, there's a bias towards interesting findings, right? And then, so like there's not a lot of headlines like, Dan and Mike's research confirmed the null hypothesis. There is actually no difference.
Right.
The hypothesis was disconfirmed. Nobody cares about that. But like when something new and noteworthy emerges, particularly if it has narrative elements, I think frequently it crosses over into more like mainstream media, mainstream perception, and that's frequently where it's flawed. That's where lots of times pop psychology, pseudoscience, those kinds of things kick in, because then it becomes more like the realm of lore, where like, you hear a story and then you tell that story again, and that's kind of what humans have evolved to do. Like we're natural storytellers, we're myth makers, and we spend a lot of time talking to each other, so a lot of that involves telling stories. The challenge is sometimes those narratives are more powerful than the scientific evidence. And, the Zimbardo study was the other one that recently went through a similar retrospective, where it's this classic study out of Stanford where a bunch of volunteers were identified either as prisoners or guards, and then they ran through like a simulated experience for, I think it was a few weeks. And, notoriously the guards became increasingly abusive, sadistic, and then the prisoners, became more prisoner mentality. But a lot of that research of late was sort of debunked, so research that becomes prevailing frequently is then replaced by subsequent research. And it's just a reminder that, science is only true based on what we know today, and things that we believe to be true today may be disproven in the future. And, you just have to be comfortable having some flexibility in your thinking, and also being critical about new findings. Just because something is new and noteworthy doesn't necessarily mean the science is incontrovertible and it'll never be revisited in the future. Actually, the opposite is probably true, where like there will be a better understanding of this based on future research, and false positives do happen. So, So I thought that one was kind of cool. The summer slide also sounds like a dance, right? Like
yes.
You need to do your version of the electric slide more about learning over the summer and call it the summer slide. So send us your videos if you're doing that.
There's our TikTok entry. That's where it is.
Get the TikTok account going.
There it is. There it is.
What else they got here, Dan? They got cut the arts at your own risk.
Makes sense to me as a art student growing up. I am very much behind the arts, but saying that grades go up when arts are added and when arts are a focal point of different schools and different administrations, that student reading goes up and other pieces of their educational output. So I can't say I'm surprised by this, but I do like to see that the research is still happening and that the findings are being shared. So no real surprise there.
And, it's also a reminder that, as the future of work is going to be evolving, like spending more time with the arts, understanding how to make things, how to be a musician, be an actor, be a performer, those are likely going to continue to be meaningful, viable career paths as humans. So developing programs that encourage that is good. And then there was some discussion here about how that it helps with the executive functions of the kid's brain to think about how to perform at that level, which I actually think is an interesting insight as well. I've always thought about that as looking back on my test prep experience, like when you're taking a test, you're expected to perform at a high level, and almost reminds me of like good athletes, good musicians, good performers. I think have a way to self-regulate and understand themselves to kind of dial things in, and giving people an opportunity to do that, not just in an athletic context or in an academic context, but also in an artistic context, I think is hugely important. And I think it's an important counterpoint to the risk of being over-indexed on STEM. It's why, STEAM, put the A in STEAM to bring the arts into play. This would certainly encourage that type of thinking.
Next up is the idea of students with disabilities, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, the importance of early intervention, getting in there as early as possible to understand what help they need in the classroom, at home, with their learning on a regular basis. But also, I will say probably to use the word scary, the disappointing point here is the second paragraph from the article from Edutopia, is that only 17% of teachers say they feel adequately trained by their certification programs, according to a new report. And that means teachers aren't prepared to help these students. And that is obviously a failing, as well as students with special needs become more widespread in classrooms, more classrooms that are inclusive rather than specific special ed classrooms. Some teachers just are not prepared to handle those students. And that's got to change. Like, that's obviously a teacher training fact, and they need to find a way to make sure they're ready to teach all the students in their classroom as best as they can.
Yeah, exactly. And there's more related topics, I think, throughout the rest of this article. So like we would really encourage folks to take a look at Youki Terada. Youki, we may reach out to you, try to get more perspective around the type of educational research that's powering this. This is from Edutopia, which is a good follow on Twitter and elsewhere. But yeah, I think, maybe we can cherry pick any others that jump out at either or both of us, Dan. But it does make me think that this type of research is the type of thing we should be covering more regularly, I think, on the show, and figure out how to give it its due, maybe with the researchers themselves. So like one thing that I think we did a nice job of, but I'd love to do more of, is actually bringing the researchers into the conversation. The other thing I'd love to do more heading into next year is bring in some educators who are, maybe aware and using some of these interventions based on this type of research, but also educators who haven't seen this research before, go through a list like this and say, all right, well, you teach 8th grade. What do you think about these findings? Which of them ring true? Which of them are surprising? Which of them might change your behavior moving forward? Because I do think those bias loops that we were talking about, they can even happen in terms of the type of research that gets published. So
absolutely.
What else jumps out at you though, Dan? I don't think we necessarily need. There's a lot. I was reading
right.
the list, and I was like, this is going to take a little while.
Well, I would say as a fan of sleep, the research from Seattle is great, that more sleep for students leads to better grades. I,
Right.
again, think that's been sort of a prevailing wisdom thing, that get them more sleep where you can.
Yeah.
I will also point out, it talks about growth mindset. We've talked about many times here on the show, that a little bit maybe of the Gartner hype cycle there, that it went through a little bit of trough of disillusionment, but coming back out the other side, the growth mindset. And I see it a lot. I've talked about it many times in my daughter's school, not the whole idea of I can't do this yet. But I think that's an idea and term that will stick with us into the near future. I don't think it's going anywhere quite yet.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to round it out, I guess a couple other ones here. Fewer warnings for Black students. So that's around discipline for Black middle school students relative to their white peers. Fewer warnings are given to Black students before they're disciplined somehow, sent to the principal's office than white students, getting back to that same stereotyping challenges that exist everywhere. That's one that I would love to understand. What types of interventions are being tried to correct for this? Like, is it just talking about it elevates awareness, or are there like new ways to train or break out of the implicit bias problem? We still probably could do a little more follow-up on how that's happening in the corporate world too. Thinking back on the Starbucks diversity training, after their incident in Philadelphia that we covered a bit. And then there's one other here, I guess, on paper beats screens, says a new study, but read the fine print. And this is an education professor at University of North Dakota, Virginia Clinton, analyzed, I guess it's a meta-analysis of 33 studies, and found that children and adults tend to remember more when they read on paper than on a digital device. But the important caveat there is that it's almost like a very slimmed down digital device to make it exactly comparable. So right. Like no hyperlinks, no additional functionality, no access to media, like all the things you can do in a digital format were not provided. So like as a pure, flat eye reading experience, print appears to work better based on this meta-analysis. And, I got to say print's pretty resilient. I don't think it's going anywhere. It's kind of like Mark Twain back in the day. Reports of print's death are greatly exaggerated. Like, I think we're always going to want to have something to hold on to.
Yep.
It'll just be interesting as the digital gets increasingly deep and immersive and feature rich. Is there a point at which it's better than the pure print experience? And then there's also the benefit of just being off screens. Like, is there a different sort of like neurological state that kicks in when no screens are engaged? And not to play the parent of a young child card too much, but I definitely see it in Matthew. Like, anytime there's a screen anywhere in the room that is activated, he's drawn to it like a moth to a flame.
Yep. And
I think it's a little bit like a moth to a flame too. So like, I'm not expecting that to get any easier. That and remote controls, but that's a whole nother kettle of fish.
When you put the remote control on the screen,
oh yeah,
that's when all bets are off.
Yeah,
they can't.
It's like the desensitization. You just put them in a room full of remotes.
Exactly.
It's great to see what he does.
Crawling through it. I will say, I always was taught that paper beat rock, but I guess it beats screen as well. But beyond that, I do think the interesting point here is that they took out all of the benefits of the screen, right? The idea of clicking links and getting the extra media and getting, so what that comparison to your point is. And something that doesn't come up here, I did click through and see research. You always want to know who's sponsoring the research. See the base of why someone is asking these questions, where the research is coming from. This is more in consumer products to me than education and learning, but understand who's putting that research out there, why they're doing it, what their questions were, and why that is out there, I think is important. We'll talk about it more in 2020.
Yeah, and I think on that point too, in the academic space, like, people generally don't mind going down a rabbit hole every so often, but like, understand when you read like a survey of academic research like this, there's frequently an entire body of work that is presenting both this and one or more alternative understandings of it, and this is the latest science. So this is what is, now needs to be replicated, and it's easy for academic research to kind of just be treated as almost like a surface fact when you go a little deeper, you understand there's still uncertainty there. That being said, like I love that all of this is condensed into one place, and with hyperlinks, just to your point there, Dan, so that if you want to go deeper into the original research, or if you want to look at supporting things, it's all there within this Edutopia article. And we'd love to hear more, both from researchers who are presenting learning findings like these, and then also from folks who are communicators, journalists, writers, just people who are playing with their head up. If you see anything that you think would be relevant to folks who are trying to understand how to learn better, we'd love to use this podcast as an opportunity to sort of showcase and highlight new and surprising stuff. And it's been a fun year, Dan. Right? This is our one of our last shows of 2019. Looking forward to 2020. Any parting thoughts as we wrap it up?
A year of some transitions and some more to come in 2020. Some things on the up and up, looking like continued growth for the podcast itself. So selfishly looking forward to that next year. And I echo Mike's, if you are researching, if you're a teacher who has found some of this research and have tried to implement it in your classroom, we'd love to hear from you as well. You don't even have to necessarily come on as a guest. Just tell us how it's going. Give us some background information. We'd love to be able to talk about that here in 2020. We're going to start looking ahead so much and trying to shape some of these topics, really with Mike's work and Mike's research out there, getting in touch with some great people as well in the community. So look forward to talking to more and more folks as the year goes on. So really excited about what 2020 has in store. We do have prediction shows coming up and look ahead as well. So with that said, we really appreciate each and every one of you listening to Trending in Education. Find us on Twitter at Trending in Ed, same on Facebook. LinkedIn is linkedin.com/trending in education, a great place for these discussions. And of course, it's trendingineducation.com. Until next time, thanks for listening to Trending in Education.